There is a photograph I keep returning to. It was taken in 1925 in the Brazilian interior, and it shows a man standing at the edge of a clearing he was never supposed to reach. Percy Harrison Fawcett, Lieutenant Colonel, Fellow of the Royal Geographical Society, a man trained to observe, record and report exactly what he sees. He walked into that forest. He never came back, and 3 governments spent the next decade making absolutely sure nobody followed him. I've been sitting on this footage for 8 months. 8 months of cross-referencing expedition logs, colonial archives, and documents that were, and I want to be precise here, not declassified, documents that were simply misfiled in places they shouldn't be, accessible to anyone patient enough to look. What I found changed how I understand every map I've ever trusted, because Fawcett didn't disappear. Not exactly. He arrived. He found what he went looking for. And whatever that was, whatever he was standing in front of in those final unrecorded days, was considered dangerous enough that the silence around it has been actively maintained for 100 years. The question was never what happened to Fawcett. The question is what happened when he arrived. We're about to walk the same path he did. Let's establish something first. Percy Fawcett was not a romantic. He was not a fantasist. Before he vanished into the Mato Grosso in April of 1925, he had already completed 7 grueling expeditions into South American interior territories. Surveys that were officially commissioned, methodically documented, and accepted without controversy by the Royal Geographical Society in London. He had mapped rivers that European cartography had never acknowledged. He had negotiated with indigenous nations that official colonial records described conveniently as uncontactable. He was not a man who saw things that weren't there. So when Fawcett began writing, in letters, in field notes, in private correspondence with colleagues, about what he called Z, we have to ask ourselves a question. Not whether he was confused, not whether he was delusional, but why a meticulous, decorated, institutionally credentialed surveyor became, in the final decade of his career, increasingly insistent that there existed, somewhere in the unexplored Brazilian interior, the physical remnants of a civilization of staggering antiquity and scale. He called it a city, a buried city, stone, organized, old in a way that challenged the accepted sequence of human development in the Western Hemisphere. He wasn't guessing. He had sources, among them a document he referred to as Manuscript 512, held in the archives of the National Library of Rio de Janeiro. An 18th century Portuguese account attributed to a Bandeirante expedition of 1753, describing the discovery of a ruined city in the Bahian interior, stone archways, inscriptions in an unidentified script, buildings of a scale inconsistent with any civilization the Portuguese believed had ever occupied that territory. The document exists. It is catalogued. You can request it. What you cannot easily find is any serious institutional engagement with what it describes. The silence around that document is deafening, and Fawcett knew it. He wrote about it. He said in correspondence with a colleague in 1920 that the academic establishment had no interest in revising what they have already decided. That is a remarkable thing for a Fellow of the Royal Geographical Society to write. It suggests he had tried. It suggests he had brought the question forward through legitimate channels, and some mechanism of institutional closure had met him on the other side of it. But here's the thing. Fawcett was not the beginning of this story. He wasn't even close to the beginning. Go back almost 4 centuries earlier, 1541. A Spanish conquistador named Francisco de Orellana descends from the Andes and becomes the first European to navigate the full length of the Amazon River. His chronicler, a Dominican friar named Gaspar de Carvajal, keeps a detailed account of the journey. And what Carvajal records consistently, repeatedly, across thousands of kilometers of river, is not a wilderness. It is a civilization. He describes cities, not villages, or cities stretching along the riverbanks for kilometers at a time with populations he estimates in the hundreds of thousands. He describes roads connecting settlements. He describes organised agriculture at a scale he finds difficult to comprehend. He describes ceramic work and textile production. He describes, in one passage that scholars have since handled very carefully, towers of white stone visible from the river. Now, the standard academic treatment of Carvajal is that he exaggerated, that he was a friar seeking to impress his superiors in Spain, that the scale of what he recorded reflects wishful thinking rather than observation. This raises a simple but critical question. Why would a friar, a man whose spiritual credibility depended on honest witness, fabricate the existence of cities that could, in theory, be verified by any subsequent expedition? Why invent something checkable? And why, if he invented it, do the specific details he records, the dark, rich soil, the scale of the riverbank settlements, the organised road networks, align so precisely with what modern archaeological work has begun, slowly and reluctantly, to confirm? The official explanation collapses here because we now know, and this is not contested, this is published in peer-reviewed archaeology, that much of the Amazon basin shows evidence of large-scale pre-contact human modification. The terra preta soils, the geoglyphs visible only from the air carved into the Amazonian earth in geometric patterns spanning hundreds of meters, the causeways, the raised agricultural fields in regions that conventional models said were too hostile to support complex settlement. Carvajal wasn't exaggerating. He was describing something real, something that was then, and this is where it becomes impossible to ignore, almost entirely gone within a century of European contact. Not transformed, not assimilated, gone. Let me introduce you to another figure. Cândido Mariano da Silva Rondon, Brazilian army officer, founder of what became FUNAI, the Brazilian agency responsible for indigenous affairs. A man who, between 1890 and 1930, spent more cumulative time in the Brazilian interior than perhaps any other person with access to pen, paper, and institutional authority. Rondon mapped, Rondon surveyed. Rondon laid the telegraph lines that connected interior Brazil to the coast. He was accompanied in 1913 and 1914 by Theodore Roosevelt himself, an expedition whose official account, published as Through the Brazilian Wilderness, is a fascinating document, not least for what it doesn't say. Roosevelt mentions, briefly and without elaboration, that Rondon showed him certain features of the landscape that he was not able to include in his published account at Rondon's specific request. Read that again. A former president of the United States on a co-led scientific expedition notes in his own published memoir that a Brazilian colonel asked him to omit specific observations from the record. What were those observations? We don't know. Roosevelt honoured the request. Rondon, in his own extensive published writings, doesn't return to the subject. The gap is there, in plain view, sitting in the published record of one of the most documented expeditions in the history of South American exploration, and that's where Rondon becomes impossible to ignore. Because Rondon was not a careless man. He was a man of fierce professional integrity who believed demonstrably in the responsible management of information about the Brazilian interior. Which prompts a very specific question. What kind of information requires that kind of management? What does a surveyor see that causes him to turn to an ex-president and say, quietly but firmly, don't write that down? The deeper I went into Rondon's declassified correspondence, the more I noticed a pattern, not of lies, exactly, but of careful, deliberate incompleteness. Descriptions that begin and then stop. References to formations that are not elaborated upon. Reports filed to the Brazilian military that are noted in indices but have never been located in their original form. Not lost, noted in indices, present in the cataloguing system, simply unavailable. Let's talk about the speed. This is something that doesn't get discussed enough. When we examine historical moments in which evidence of pre-contact Amazonian complexity surfaced, genuinely surfaced, in ways that the institutional apparatus couldn't immediately categorize, the response time is in retrospect, extraordinary. Fawcett disappeared in 1925. Within months, the Royal Geographical Society had issued a statement categorising his expedition as a private venture undertaken against institutional advice. This is technically true, but the framing is worth examining. The effect of that statement was to preemptively discredit whatever Fawcett might have been moving toward. If he found nothing, he was a romantic who died for a fantasy. If he found something, well, he'd already been officially characterised as someone operating outside the bounds of credible inquiry. Heads I win, tails you lose. Multiple search expeditions were launched in subsequent decades. Some of them, organised by Fawcett's own son Brian, made it reasonably far into the Mato Grosso before being turned back by disease, by terrain, by logistical failure, and in at least 2 documented cases, by explicit intervention from Brazilian military authorities, who cited, variously, territorial sovereignty concerns and indigenous protection protocols. Both of those justifications are legitimate on their face. That's what makes them so effective. You cannot argue against protecting indigenous populations. You cannot argue against Brazilian sovereignty over Brazilian territory. And yet the practical effect of both justifications in every documented case was the same. The search stopped, the coordinates remained unvisited, the interior remained officially unmapped in the specific areas Fawcett had indicated. This raises a simple but critical question. Not whether the justifications were sincere, not whether the individuals involved had good reasons, but whether the outcome, repeated, consistent, geographically specific, can be adequately explained by coincidence. The evidence suggests something much larger than coincidence tends to produce. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, deforestation in the Brazilian state of Acre began revealing something that had, quite literally, been hidden under the canopy. Geoglyphs, geometric earthworks carved into the Amazonian earth, covering an area of approximately 13,000 square kilometres. Circles, squares, octagons, some of them nearly 300 metres in diameter, arranged with a geometric regularity that is, depending on your assumptions, either evidence of sophisticated surveying technology or a remarkable coincidence of natural formation. Except they aren't natural formations. No one argues they are. The academic debate is not whether they were made by humans, it is who made them, when, how many people it required, and most importantly, what they were for. The official consensus as it currently stands is that these were ceremonial enclosures, gathering spaces, the pre-contact equivalent of a village green scaled up significantly. And maybe that's right. But here's the strangest part. The geoglyphs are found, with remarkable consistency, at the edges of what we now know to be the densest concentrations of terra preta soil and domesticated tree species. They sit, like markers, at the boundaries of the biological systems we described earlier. Some researchers working, it should be noted, largely outside of institutional funding structures, have begun to suggest that the geoglyphs may have functioned as something closer to infrastructure than ceremony. Boundary markers, drainage systems, orientation grids for large-scale landscape management. If that hypothesis has any substance to it, and I am not claiming it does, I am asking whether it might, then what we are looking at is not a series of scattered ceremonial sites. We are looking at the physical infrastructure of a managed landscape, a civilization that operated not by clearing the forest but by engineering it, not conquering nature, not coexisting with nature, designing it, and that would require a level of biological and geographical knowledge that our current historical models say simply did not exist in this hemisphere at the relevant time period. The official explanation collapses here, not dramatically, quietly, incrementally, under the weight of its own accumulated exceptions. Now we arrive at what I consider the most unsettling aspect of all of this. Not the geoglyphs, not the terra preta, not the domesticated forest species or the buried cities or the sealed archives. Each of those individually can be managed. Each of those individually has an explanation that fits within the existing framework, if you're willing to stretch that framework a little. What cannot be easily managed is the coordination, because this is not an Amazon story. The deeper I went, and I want to be precise about this because the research took months and led in directions I did not anticipate, the more clearly a world-spanning pattern emerged. Pre-contact civilizations with evidence of large-scale landscape management, biological systems built into the soil in the forest canopy, geometric earthworks at the margins of those systems, and then, in each case, an abrupt break in the continuity of the archaeological record, followed by institutional management of whatever came after. This pattern exists in the Amazon. It exists in the great river valleys of sub-Saharan Africa, where archaeologists have found evidence of large-scale pre-contact water management infrastructure that the accepted model says was beyond the organizational capacity of the populations in question. It exists in Southeast Asia, where the hydraulic civilization of Angkor, which we know about, which is famous, which is studied, may represent not an isolated anomaly, but a regional example of something far more widespread and far less examined. It exists, as we discussed in previous episodes, in the systematic transformation of European park systems in the 1850s through 1890s, a period during which, across multiple countries and multiple administrative systems, with no apparent central coordination, the composition of urban forests was dramatically altered. Provider trees were removed and replaced with ornamental species, and the institutional memory of what had previously occupied those spaces was quietly archived rather than celebrated. The same period, the same pattern, multiple continents, multiple administrative systems with no obvious means of coordination. This is the problem that doesn't go away when you try to rationalize it. Not why it happened in the Amazon, not why it happened in Europe, not why it happened in Southeast Asia, but how. Something that required, at minimum, a shared understanding of what was being removed and why, manifests across disconnected administrative systems in the same historical window. Who was coordinating? Through what mechanism? And why does the coordination itself leave no trace in the conventional documentary record? These are not rhetorical questions. They are the questions that the evidence accumulated and laid side by side actually generates. Now, I have to stop here and bring in something from our previous investigation, because it matters more here than I realized when we first looked at it. We examined the possibility that the great natural parks and ancient forests of the world, Białowieża in Poland, Yakushima in Japan, Aokigahara at the base of Fuji, may not be natural at all in the sense we understand that word. We looked at the hypothesis that these forests were remnants of something more intentional. Self-sustaining biological systems, call them what you will, that once fed, housed and organized human populations in ways that our current agricultural model has no framework for understanding. And we looked at the systematic transformation of old world urban parks in the late 19th century, the removal of what some researchers have called provider trees, and the remarkable speed with which institutions moved to replace them with ornamental species that serve no nutritional function. I want to connect that thread here because the Amazon forces you to. The terra preta soils of the Amazon, the famous black earth that appears throughout the basin in concentrated patches, are not natural. This is not a fringe claim. This is the established consensus of soil scientists and archaeologists. The terra preta is anthropogenic. It was created, it is extraordinarily fertile, it self-regenerates, and it exists in exactly the places where Carvajal reported large-scale settlement. Someone made that soil. Someone built a biological system into the earth itself that would continue producing, continue supporting life for centuries after whatever happened to the people who made it. Once you see it, you can't unsee it, and the trees. The specific distribution of edible and useful tree species throughout the Amazon is not random. A landmark study published and then rather quietly absorbed into the academic literature without the cultural reckoning it arguably deserved, found that the areas of the Amazon most densely populated in the pre-contact era correspond directly to areas that today have statistically anomalous concentrations of domesticated or semi-domesticated food tree species: Brazil nut, cacao, acai, peach palm. Species that produce reliably and abundantly without being planted anew each season. Is this a forest, or is it a system? Is it wilderness, or is it something that was built, left running, and that we have been walking through for 5 centuries without understanding what we were looking at? The pattern repeats with unsettling precision. Biała Wieża, Yakushima, the old growth forests of the Pacific Northwest, and here, in the Amazon basin, at a scale that dwarfs all of them combined. Systems that appear natural, systems that produce, systems that, when you remove the assumption of wilderness and look at the distribution of what grows where, begin to suggest design. Who designed them? When? And why, in each case, does the institutional response to that question follow the same pattern: acknowledge, narrow, redirect, and ultimately shelve? If this is the kind of question you find yourself unable to stop thinking about, if you're the kind of person who reads the footnote before the main text, this channel exists for you. Subscribe. Leave a comment below with which thread you want me to pull next. I read all of them. I want to return to Fawcett because I think we've been somewhat unfair to him in the popular imagination. He has been portrayed in the century since his disappearance as a kind of magnificent eccentric, a man too in love with mystery to be trusted as a witness. The 2017 film based on his story, visually beautiful, narratively generous, frames him as a dreamer, a romantic, a man pursuing a vision that his contemporaries found impossible to take seriously, but read his actual correspondence. Not the excerpts that appear in biographies, the letters held at the Royal Geographical Society archives, some of which have been partially digitized and are available to researchers with the appropriate credentials. What you find is not a romantic. You find a meticulous, increasingly frustrated scientist. In a letter dated 1921, Fawcett writes to his colleague Edward Douglas Fawcett, his brother, with a level of specificity that is difficult to reconcile with fantasy. He describes, based on accounts gathered from indigenous informants across multiple language groups, a consistent set of features: stone construction, elevated roadways connecting separate structures, evidence of hydraulic engineering, and, this is the part that is rarely quoted, what he describes as cultivated growth of an unusual character, neither wild nor domestic in the sense we understand either term. Cultivated growth of an unusual character. That phrase sat in that letter for over a century before anyone thought to connect it to the terra preta research, before anyone placed it alongside the domesticated tree distribution studies, before anyone thought to ask whether Fawcett's indigenous informants, speaking in multiple languages, from communities separated by hundreds of kilometers, were describing the same thing that Carvajal had described in 1541. A managed system, a forest that was also an infrastructure, something built, not cleared. And here's what I keep returning to. Fawcett believed, stated explicitly in writing, in documents that still exist, that what he was looking for was not a lost city in the conventional sense, not ruins, not abandoned stone. He wrote more than once that he expected to find something more ambiguous, something that might not even be immediately recognizable as the product of human construction, because it had been built to endure by operating within natural systems rather than against them, a civilization that built with the forest rather than instead of it. Does that not describe precisely what the archaeological and biological evidence is now beginning to confirm? In 1961, Brazil established FUNAI, the indigenous protection agency that Rondon's earlier organization had presaged. Among its many functions, FUNAI controls access to territories designated as indigenous lands including large portions of the Mato Grosso interior. This is appropriate, this is necessary. I am not suggesting otherwise. But it is worth noting, calmly, without accusation, that the territories over which Funai exercises the most stringent access control correspond, with a geographic precision that invites at least one follow-up question, to the areas identified in Fawcett's expedition notes as the most likely locations of concentrated pre-contact infrastructure, not all indigenous protected territories. These specific ones, Brazilian academic archaeologists have noted this, quietly, in footnotes, in the kind of language that signals awareness of a sensitive issue. The phrase that recurs is, access constraints have limited systematic survey of the most promising areas. Read that slowly. Access constraints have limited systematic survey of the most promising areas. We are not, and I want to be careful here, suggesting that indigenous protection is a pretext. The protection of indigenous communities from external interference is a genuine moral and political necessity, and its history in Brazil is a history of catastrophic failure to do enough, not of doing too much. But the question is not whether the protection is real. The question is whether the protection and the restriction of archaeological access are, in some cases, serving more than one purpose simultaneously. Whether something that is genuinely necessary can also be, quietly and without anyone needing to state it explicitly, convenient. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. The deepest territories, the most restricted access, the areas where Fawcett was going, all sealed, all legitimate, all simultaneously, and with no apparent coordination, beyond the reach of systematic archaeological survey. There is a specific quality to what happens when researchers get close. Anna Roosevelt, granddaughter of Theodore Roosevelt, archaeologist, and a figure whose credentials are essentially unimpeachable, conducted groundbreaking work at Marajó Island at the mouth of the Amazon in the late 1980s and 1990s. What she found fundamentally challenged the accepted model of Amazonian pre-contact complexity. Large mound structures, evidence of dense long-term sedentary habitation, ceramic traditions of extraordinary sophistication predating many of their supposed New World contemporaries. Her work was published, it was peer-reviewed, it is cited, and then in the broader cultural conversation about human history in the Americas, it was largely absorbed without consequence, without the revision of textbooks, without the kind of public acknowledgement that findings of that magnitude arguably warranted. It entered the literature, it sat there, and the framework it should have disrupted continued largely undisrupted. The silence was deafening, not suppression, not erasure, something subtler and in some ways more effective. Acknowledgement without integration, publication without consequence, the appearance of open inquiry producing none of its expected results. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision. LiDAR surveys conducted over Cambodian jungle in 2012 revealed urban infrastructure surrounding Angkor that tripled the known extent of the city. Published, peer-reviewed, celebrated briefly in the science press, and then absorbed. The framework remained. The revision did not occur at scale. The public understanding of what Angkor was and what it implied did not meaningfully change. The geoglyphs of Acre, noted in the 1970s, systematically studied in the 1990s, published and peer-reviewed in the 2000s. And still, in the popular historical narrative, Amazonia before contact is characterized primarily as wilderness. Not wilderness with evidence of large-scale infrastructure. Not wilderness that may have been, in some meaningful sense, a managed system of extraordinary antiquity. Wilderness. How does that happen? How does evidence accumulate across decades of peer-reviewed publication and produce so little revision in the foundational story? The evidence suggests something much larger than academic inertia. Fawcett's last confirmed communication was a letter to his wife, Nina, dated May 29, 1925, from a camp he called Dead Horse Camp named for a horse that had died there on a previous expedition. He wrote that he was in good health, that the party was in good spirits, that he was about to enter territory that he believed no European had mapped. He wrote that he expected to be out of contact for months, possibly longer. He wrote that if the expedition succeeded in what he believed it would find, the whole story of the Americas will need to be rewritten. The whole story of the Americas will need to be rewritten. He was a careful man, a precise man, a man who chose his words deliberately. He did not write, "We may find something interesting." He did not write, "I believe there are ruins worth examining." He wrote that if he found what he expected to find, the whole story of the Americas would need to be rewritten, and then he walked into the forest. And the forest kept him. No remains were ever credibly recovered. No definitive account of what happened was ever established. In the century since his disappearance, more than 100 people have died attempting to determine what became of him. 100 people for one expedition, into one region, of one country. Not why, not how, not under which circumstances. He vanished. But what was he going toward that made that level of subsequent human cost, paid voluntarily by researchers and adventurers across a century, feel proportionate to the question? I've spent a long time with this material now, long enough to lose, then regain, then lose again any certainty I thought I had about what it means. Here is what I can say with confidence. The Amazon basin shows evidence of large-scale, sophisticated, pre-contact human civilization that was present, was witnessed by European observers, was documented by those observers, and then, within a remarkably compressed historical window, effectively ceased to be a subject of serious mainstream inquiry. The biological systems that civilization appears to have built, the terra preta, the managed tree distributions, the hydraulic earthworks, are still there. Still producing, still operating in some residual sense on whatever logic originally animated them. Like the old growth forests of Białowieża and Yakushima, like the groves of Aokigahara, where the trees grow in forms that defy easy naturalistic explanation, like the parks of European cities where something was removed in the 1870s and 1880s and replaced with something that looks similar but functions differently. The Amazon may be a system still running its original programming, long after anyone who understood that programming is gone. The forest remembers, even if we don't. The researchers who have come closest to the interior, Fawcett, Rondon, Roosevelt, the geoglyph surveyors, the terra preta scientists, have each, in their own way and in their own discipline, arrived at the same edge. An edge where the accepted model stops accounting for the evidence, where the explanations become strained, where the footnotes begin doing the work that the main text refuses to do. And at that edge, in each case, something happens. Access is restricted, funding is redirected, findings are published and then quietly absorbed without consequence. Requests to revisit specific coordinates are denied on grounds that are simultaneously reasonable and convenient. I am not telling you what to conclude from that pattern. I am asking you to look at it, not at the individual anomalies, the geoglyphs, the Manuscript 512, the Roosevelt omission, the sealed territories, not at any single thread, but at the shape of the pattern, at the way the anomalies cluster, at the way the silences appear, not randomly, but precisely at the moments and locations where the most consequential questions are being asked. What was Fawcett walking toward? What did Orellana actually see along those riverbanks in 1541? What did Rondon ask Roosevelt not to write down? And who or what has been tending this forest in the Amazon, in the old parks of Europe, in the ancient groves of Japan and Poland, long after the civilization that planted it stopped being visible in the historical record? The deeper I go, the larger the silence gets, and the forest, that impossible, productive, geometrically organized, biologically managed forest, just keeps growing.